مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بنبرات هادئة وموزونة خففت جلسات الاستماع أمام مجلس الشيوخ لنيل غورساتش المرشح للمحكمة الدستورية العليا تخفيفا اشتدت الحاجة إليه بعد التوتر الشديد الناجم عن الدراما السياسية الدائرة في واشنطن هذه الأيام. خلال شهريه في المكتب البيضاوي أصدر الرئيس ترامب الكثير من القرارات الافتزازية المثيرة للجدل، ولكن القرار الذي يشير إليه معظم الخبراء على أنه قراره الأكثر ذكاء وحكمة هو ترشيح قاضي من كولورادو لشغل المقعد الشاغر في المحكمة الدستورية العليا. وحين شهد أخيرا أمام مجلس الشيوخ حريصا على تجنب أي شيء افتزازي ومثير للجدل بدوره، بدأ غورساتش أنه يثبت بعد نظر الخبراء لمناقشة السياسة والجوانب السياسية المحيطة بترشيح أحدث قضاة المحكمة الدستورية العليا. يسرني أن أرحب بواحد من أوسع الصحفيين إطلاعاً في واشنطن، وهو ديفيد هوكينز. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Well, if there's one decision that both critics and supporters say President Trump got right, it was his nomination of Neil Gorsuch to be the new Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. So let's take a look at what this decision means, where it came from, and who Neil Gorsuch is. And I'm delighted to welcome David Hawkins with me. David, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be with you.
So let's take a look at this decision. Supreme Court justices come and go. Why is this such an important decision for this president?
Well, they do come and go, but they don't come and go that often. There are only 9 of them. This is the first, Judge Gorsuch would be the first new justice on the court in almost 7 years. It's a lifetime appointment. It's the judicial branch of the U.S. government is the least subject to the political whims of the moment, because once you're on the court, you can stay for as long as you like, unless you do something essentially criminal, and that rarely happens. So it is Donald Trump's first attempt to leave a legacy that will almost certainly outlast him. Judge Gorsuch is only, I think, 49 years old, so he could be on the court for the rest of my life.
So this appointment was made possible by the death of Antonin Scalia, who appeared on the show some years ago. So first, let's start with the Constitution. It was written in 1789 and has served us remarkably well for 200 years. How should we interpret that 200-year-old document today?
Well, there's some disagreement among judges and scholars. Until about 50 years ago, I think everyone would have said that you interpret it today the way it would have been interpreted when it was adopted.
He's known as a strict constructionist. What does that mean? Why should our viewers be interested? And how does that play in American politics?
Right, and just sort of to state the obvious, Judge Gorsuch would be a strict constructionist in the Scalia mold, so he would be, ideologically, it would be sort of a somewhat even trade. Strict constructionist is the legal term for sort of narrow interpretations of what the Constitution means. The strict constructionists essentially say, read the U.S. Constitution as it was written. Don't overlay that reading with a lot of concerns about modernity or what the framers might have meant had they lived today. Think about the Constitution as it was written and don't extrapolate from that.
What would be an example in contemporary legislation or politics where this would come to play?
Perhaps the most famous opinion that Scalia ever wrote. Justice Scalia ended up on the losing side of most cases. He was a hugely important figure in American law, but mostly because he was railing against the majority. He was on the losing end most often. Perhaps his most famous majority opinion, where he actually won the case, his side prevailed, was a case called the Heller case. It essentially reaffirmed the right of individuals to own firearms. For more than 200 years, the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which talked about the right to bear arms, had been whittled away by the courts. But Justice Scalia said the pure language of what that amendment says means that a person should have the right to have a gun in his or her home, subject maybe to some reasonable regulation, but ultimately the right to keep and bear a gun is yours. So, I mean, essentially Justice Scalia was saying, forget about all this modern interpretations and how guns have affected society. The Constitution says what it says when it was written in the late 18th century. Pure and simple, you have a right to own a gun. So that's kind of strict constructionism.
Now, what did Donald Trump say throughout the campaign about this opening at the Supreme Court? What sort of promises did he make? And what sort of decision-making process did he promise to identify who he would nominate to fill this seat?
So that's a great question, because Donald Trump's own background and his own life story and his own experience in business and the things that he'd said when he was a businessman not running for president gave Republican conservatives a lot of concern. They thought that he was inconsistent at best as to his own views about the Constitution and about the sort of social issues, particularly that Supreme Court justices tend to decide and which the voters care about a great deal. So what Mr. Trump, when he was candidate, said, he said, I will actually go to some experts. He went to some conservative think tanks, and he said, they're going to help me come up with a list of, ended up being 21 judges. They were all judges. They were mostly on state, many of them were on state courts or on federal appeals courts. And I promise you that I will pick one of these people that my friends in the conservative movement had helped me come up with my list, and that is what he did. Judge Gorsuch was on that list. He wasn't on the original list of 10. There was actually one list of 10, and some conservatives thought, some of the superstars of conservative judicial life aren't on there. Shouldn't Gorsuch be on there? And so he amended his list. He added some more, and Gorsuch was on that list.
And is there a process since Donald Trump went to the White House that narrowed this list down, that ended up with Neil Gorsuch?
There was apparently soon after the president took office, they did try and whittle it down. I think the president ended up interviewing 3 of those 21, and he apparently liked Gorsuch right away. They seemed to have a bond, and that was the decision. And he seems, what the president said when he announced Judge Gorsuch, who has been on, I should just sort of back up and say, Judge Gorsuch has been a federal judge for 10 years. He is an appeals court judge, so there are sort of 3 levels of the federal courts in the U.S. There are the trial courts. Then the first round of appeals goes to a dozen regional appeals courts, and then any appeals from those dozen appeals courts go to the Supreme Court, which has the right to say, no, what the first court got it right, or to take the cases. They take a small number of cases. Judge Gorsuch had been on the appeals court that is based in Denver for many western states for 10 years, had a solid reputation as a conservative, had a sterling reputation, sort of his credentials, have clerked for several judges, top-notch schools, the kind of things that Donald Trump said he was impressed with and has always been impressed with in the past. Donald Trump likes a guy with a great resume.
Let's take a look for a moment at the hearings that occurred recently for Neil Gorsuch. Sometimes these are great television drama. Sometimes they are revealing about a candidate. Although in recent years, candidates or nominees have figured out how to avoid revealing too much. What was the public duel between the Senate and Neil Gorsuch like?
Well, it was sort of a 3-way duel, because there was Neil Gorsuch versus the Senate Democrats and Neil Gorsuch versus the Senate Republicans. Neil Gorsuch versus the Senate Republicans was really no contest at all, because the Republicans, they're all in favor of putting Judge Gorsuch on the court. They're lockstep behind the president, think this is a great pick. So many of their questions at the hearing were almost like you'd have at a dinner party or a social gathering. They sort of asked him about his background and about his life in the West and about rodeos, and they didn't really probe his judicial philosophy all that closely, except to try and elicit promises from him that they thought would be very helpful in getting him confirmed, which would be to ask him questions about his judicial independence. Because to the extent that Judge Gorsuch would get any support from the Democrats, or to the extent he'd get support from the Democrats, it would be if he projected an image of somebody who would put on the black robe and be insulated from politics and rule on cases involving the president who nominated him however he thought the law would allow. And so the Republicans gave him plenty of chances to make that point, that he would be independent from Donald Trump, that he in fact reiterated for the TV cameras something he'd said to some senators in private, which is that Mr. Trump's, candidate Trump's criticism of the federal judiciary was disheartening and dispiriting and wasn't really a very good idea. So that was Donald Trump and the Republicans. The Democrats asked much more difficult questions. They probed his 10-year record on the bench and asked him about individual cases and about what they revealed about his own judicial philosophy. That didn't go all that effectively because, as you said when you asked me this question, in the last 20 years, the routine has been that the judges do not reveal very much at all about their own thinking. They, some would say pejoratively, they hide behind this mask of judicial independence and say, I can't tell you what I think about gun rights or the right to an abortion or the balance between the regulatory state and business freedom, because who knows, those questions may come before me in the future and I shouldn't tip my hand now. So the Democrats poked at him and he didn't really give them back much. Their line of criticism of Judge Gorsuch was that his career on the federal bench has been all about favoring the big guy over the little guy, big corporations, big institutions over the sort of the downtrodden and the little guy.
So you've seen these nomination hearings before. Was Neil Gorsuch wounded in any way in this episode?
No, he did himself no harm. He was very, very well prepared. He's clearly, he knew the environment. He's been around a while. He's understood the political environment. He actually grew up for a time in Washington because his mother actually worked for President Ronald Reagan as the chief environmental regulator, or in the case of Ronald Reagan, deregulator. So he spent his teenage years in D.C. He's a political expert. He knew how to play the game, and he did not harm himself. And he may, because of his declaring of his independence from Donald Trump, who at the moment is quite low in approval rating. He's down. He has a lower the lowest approval rating of any new president in the history of polling. He's down. His approval rating is below 40%. So declaring some independence from Donald Trump might have given him some help with the Democrats.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about the political context of the Gorsuch nomination and what it might mean for Donald Trump to get a success in getting Neil Gorsuch on the bench in just a moment. My guest today is David Hawkins. David is an insider's insider with 25 years experience reporting on how Washington works, or doesn't work, as the case may be. He is senior editor of Roll Call, the must-read newspaper covering Capitol Hill. He previously served as editor of CQ Roll Call Daily Briefing, managing editor at CQ Weekly, a bit of a contradiction in terms since that's Congressional Quarterly Weekly, and editor at CQ, covering politics, policies, and people in both the legislative and executive branches. He is a graduate of Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. So let's look at the political context here. President Trump suffered ignominious defeat on health care. The Gorsuch nomination will be his first major victory. Does this change the direction for an administration?
I'm not sure that it will help, but I'm not sure it can change the direction. One thing to remind ourselves of is that his ignominious defeat over health care was in the House of Representatives, where a small group of the most confrontationally conservative Republicans, they represent really no more than about 10% of his fellow Republicans in the House, scuttled that health care bill. The president continues to face significant problems with those super confrontational conservatives for the other things that he says he wants to do this year: rewrite the tax code, launch a huge infrastructure program, change our trade policies. All of those things are legislation that would have to happen in first the House and then the Senate. The way it works with the Supreme Court is only the 100 senators have a vote on these, on any judicial nominee, on any nominee of any kind. And so this is a game of just the Senate. And in the Senate, he only has to, in the end, he will only have to get purely Republican votes. There are a collection of somewhat moderate to conservative Democrats, many of whom are up by happy coincidence for the president. Many of these more conservative Democrats are up for re-election next year. There are actually 5 Democrats up for re-election in 2018 in states that not only voted for Donald Trump, but voted 4 years earlier for Mitt Romney. So these are sort of deep red Republican states that have Democratic senators at the moment. So those Democratic senators would be, in theory, inclined to try and show their purpleness, their centrism, by helping Donald Trump once in a while. And on the Supreme Court, would have many thought that many of those senators would have supported Gorsuch along this way. There is a lot of anger, really, among the Democratic senators and among many of their more liberal progressive constituents, that they view this seat, this vacancy that was created when Justice Scalia died more than a year ago, as something that Barack Obama should have been able to fill. He did nominate another prestigious judge, another judge with sterling credentials, Merrick Garland, who is also a federal appeals judge like Judge Gorsuch, and the Republicans said, we're not going to schedule a hearing on this guy, let alone have a vote on this guy. That is unprecedented in American history. There's never been a time before where a vacancy was allowed to go this long without any action at all on a presidential nominee. And many, many Democrats said that is an affront to the way the system is supposed to work, and an affront to us politically that we will not sit idly by.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask you about. We started our show by noting that Neil Gorsuch is essentially replacing a justice of like mind. So it's a one-for-one trade, as it were. The next opening on the Supreme Court, and there are several justices who are of, shall we say, advanced age.
Right.
These things could happen at any time. The next opening could transform the court. What will happen now that could have an impact at that battle royal later?
Forevermore, because once these rules are changed, they never go backwards. Forevermore, and starting with the next vacancy on the Supreme Court, which presumably will happen during Trump's 4-year presidency, it would just take a 51-vote majority of all the Republicans to say yes, which would give Donald Trump the political power to appoint the most conservative jurist he could find. He chose Gorsuch in part because Judge Gorsuch was not the most, while he was an originalist and a conservative, he was not the most sort of combatively conservative judge that could be found. But the next time, if Donald Trump would be at perfect liberty to pick this guy, knowing, or this woman, but it would almost certainly be a guy, they're all men that he seems to have in line for this job, he would be at liberty to do this because he could count on an all-Republican majority muscling it through. That is the argument, is that why blow up the thing that makes the Senate, the essence of the Senate, which is this power to filibuster, this power to delay, this requirement for some bipartisanship because of this extra majority. Why do that now when Judge Gorsuch is not the most combative person that Donald Trump could have found? The counter-argument is it's going to happen sooner or later, so let's rip the Band-Aid off and have our angry moment now and move on. The other, of course, important thing to note is partisan majorities change. The Senate will have a Democratic majority again someday, which means it's the Republicans who will be in the minority. The White House will change again someday. Donald Trump and the Republicans will not control the White House forever. There'll be a Democrat in the White House sooner or later. So those senators who think that they might be around long enough to see this change of party control or those senators who've experienced the shoe being on the other foot in the past, generally say, we want our rights protected when we're in the minority, or we want our rights protected when a president of our party is trying to get judges through. So let's not burn the place down now and deny ourselves the right to be protected in the future.
We only have a few seconds left. I want to ask you a big question, namely, President Trump seemed to have got the system, the process for doing this decision right. Do you see any lessons for this for all the other aspects of decision making in the early days of the Trump administration?
You know, that is such a great question, because you're right. He has played it by the book. He seemed to have taken the role seriously. He proposed somebody who was quite politically adept. He has stood back. The president himself has largely disengaged from this process. There haven't been a lot of tweets in the middle of the night saying inflammatory things. So surely it presents an opportunity for Donald Trump to look at that and say, this is the way it should work. I ought to behave that way more often. But as the first few weeks of his administration have shown, the president tends to not stick with lessons learned for very long.
Okay. Thank you so much, David, for joining us
you.
on Dakhel, Washington.
Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول الدور الذي طلبه المحكمة الدستورية العليا في النظام السياسي الأمريكي، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.